When I was 15, I began taking flying lessons. Two of my older brothers had soloed on their 16th birthdays, so that was expected of me as well. I was told I needed to work harder than others, that I needed to be nearly perfect in my tasks because girls didn't yet belong in aviation. I believed the patriarchy because I could plainly see there were no other women flying at the Lincoln, Nebraska airport. I was othered by sexist taunts and a refusal by the pilots I worked with to accept me as a professional and not a potential girlfriend. According to my parents, people were poor because they weren't working hard enough. I was taught that with hard work, anyone can change their situation. I worked hard at flying, and no matter how accomplished I became, I was given few opportunities to work as a commercial pilot in Nebraska. One company agreed to put me on their roster, but only gave me a few freight flights, always informing me that no one else was available. As a teenager, I hardly had the sophistication to discern subtle cultural signals. I only had knowledge of and words for direct kinds of violence. I perceived violence as physical altercations or war. I was not worldly enough to understand a different kind right under my nose. We know about systemic or structural violence, which is the use of institutions, laws, rules, and regulations that create barriers preventing people from meeting basic human needs, such as food and housing, safety, and community. Remember how the children felt today when they got sent back to the start and were prevented from accomplishing their goal by a barrage of seemingly new rules? The rules were purposely introduced to thwart their efforts repeatedly. Our current immigration policies are structural violence. Anti-vagrancy laws are structural violence designed to keep absolute poverty, drug use, and mental illness out of sight without addressing root causes. This kind of violence presents itself as a benefit to society, and it is if you're a member of a privileged power elite. Symbolic violence, a concept developed by sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, uses language to manipulate social outcomes. This process creates and reinforces power imbalances through the subtle or not so subtle use of language, symbols, and cultural practices rather than through physical force. It does go hand in hand with structural violence because structural violence changes what a person is illegally allowed to do. It is actionable and intended to control behaviors. Symbolic violence reflects the relationship between the dominant and the subordinate. It describes how dominant groups impose their norms and values on subordinate groups, often without the victim's awareness. It is intended to control beliefs. Frederick Douglass said in his reading, The Limits of Tyrants, "Find out what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." Frederick Douglass understood how the violence of language is as powerful as physical and institutional violence. My parents and the men I worked with wanted me to believe women are inferior in every category but childbirth. The dominant power group, in my case, males at the airport in Lincoln, Nebraska, and my parents had to publicly other me. This is the first requirement of symbolic violence. Othering establishes false narratives about people designed to exaggerate social differences. It intentionally creates a clear them and us. Men are natural and good pilots. Women are not capable of flying professionally and are only good for making babies. I was frequently asked if I was on my period in front of clients and coworkers. That is othering. The phenomenon of NIMBY, not in my backyard, employs symbolic violence. In this movement, people of privilege create a litany of othering to justify why affordable housing and social services such as halfway houses cannot be allowed in their neighborhoods. NIMBY tries to convince the world that they, the current residents, will be harmed by allowing people of a lower socioeconomic class into their community. They hide under the guise of preserving their property values, but really they are concerned about maintaining a homogeneous place to live. It comes from an entitled position. Symbolic violence perpetuates beliefs that some people deserve more than others because of their privilege and social location. Marginalized or differently classed people believe over time that they don't belong in certain communities. That is the ultimate goal of this kind of violence, to make you believe that you don't belong, that you don't deserve the same privileges, that you are less than. When people believe these inequities are just the way of the world, the balance of power is codified. It gives consent to the powerful that the power differential is as it should be. In sociological terms, this phenomenon is called social misrecognition, and I understand it completely. As a teenager, I believed the crap. I misrecognized the language I grew up with for a long time as tough love guidance, not the oppression of women that it actually was. It took decades for me to undo the symbolic violence of my childhood. Othering is accomplished through the use of dehumanizing language such as illegals and radicals. Ridicule and disparagement aimed at discrediting people is now a fixture in our politics and media. So is scapegoating, blaming marginalized groups for systemic problems. Historically, politicians have used racial rhetoric to divide groups and consolidate power. In the late 19th century American South, politicians used racial fear to prevent poor, white, and black voters from uniting, ultimately enabling them to pass Jim Crow laws and enshrine one-party control. Some politicians use labels to stigmatize ideological opponents like radical left and radical right, or vast domestic terror movement, to characterize their opponents, which can incite hostility and create a justification for future crackdowns. Symbolic violence naturalizes the discourse of othering and legitimizes the domination system. I heard so much misogynistic language in my childhood that I believed for a long time that the hierarchy of men was natural. 10 years ago, Raquel Requero, a professor of media and cyberculture, published a paper titled Social Media and Symbolic Violence, which included these words. In my opinion, social media have, in many aspects, given superpowers to symbolic violence. Social media have provided a key space for the reproduction of all sorts of discourses, including violent ones. When people share messages that girls should aspire to be beautiful, they are perpetuating a discourse rooted in thousands of years of patriarchal tradition. Even though it is sometimes unconsciously done, its effects are devastating because it helps the naturalization of these ideas about women. Not only is one person saying this, but rather hundreds of people are reinforcing this discourse, creating a knowledge that this is how things are. Each and every time, timelines of people are flooded by reinforced symbolic violence. Arthur Brooks said, and I'll tell you who Arthur Brooks is in a little bit, but he said, the more time you consume political information on social media, the more you are going to be both victim and perpetrator of contempt. That quote and what follows are from an episode of Freakonomics Radio titled How We Can Break Our Addiction to Contempt that originally aired in 2023. Arthur defines contempt as anger plus disgust and says, this nasty cocktail of anger plus disgust, it says you are worthless. And that should be reserved for something that is not human. The interviewer then asks, who are the people who are most likely to exhibit contempt or to be the target of contempt? The answer? We haven't seen racial, ethnic, or gender differences. We don't see any difference between right and left. What we do see is a difference in the consumption of media. The more time you consume political information on social media or television, the more you're going to be both a victim and perpetrator of contempt. This contempt, he contends, will drive love out of your life. Arthur Brooks is big on love, so let me tell you more about him. For 10 years, he ran the American Enterprise Institute, one of the most influential conservative think tanks in the world. He is a Republican economist who teaches at Harvard and who believes in the power of love. So it's no surprise that he has a formula for his theory. He states that your vice, which is the opposite of your virtue, is your contempt divided by your love. Love is a denominator. Increase love to decrease contempt. Love is proactive. Contempt is reactive. And he amplifies that love is a verb, and it is to will the good of the other as other. Love is to will the good of the other as other. He has come to believe that there is only one weapon that can defeat our extreme political polarization, and that's love. Arthur had collaborated with the Dalai Lama and asked him what to do when you feel contempt. The reply was to practice warm-heartedness. He suggests that you think back to a time when you answered contempt with warm-heartedness. Remember how that made you feel, and do it again and again. It seems like such a small thing to pause when contempt rises within us. But this is exactly the kind of advice I need right now. You see, and please agree, let me know if you agree, but right now I am very angry about the executive orders sitting in our White House. I am appalled by the blatant symbolic and systemic violence that is manipulating our society away from the values that we hold dear. I am angry, but I'm also afraid that my own anger will take me to the place Arthur Brooks talked about. I cannot say in one breath, I want to transform the world into a more peaceful, harmonious place, and in the next hold contempt in my heart for anyone, even those who are attacking my values. Remember, love is the common denominator. It has to be larger than contempt. This love cannot be selective. This love cannot have a them and an us. That is what the power elite wielding those violences wants, for us to perpetuate their agenda by engaging in contempt and hate and violence. And I will not consent. I will not feed the red-hot hate. We can effect resistance by first recognizing the manipulative violence in our language, in our laws, and more important, in the media we digest. Then we can make a conscious choice to stop othering and respond with language that honors the inherent worth and dignity of all, especially to those with whom we disagree. We can change the arc of symbolic violence by holding our values and our beliefs close. Yes, what we believe is more important than ever. Symbolic violence is successful only when people believe they deserve less. It uses oppressive words as weapons, so we must use liberating words in response. We can examine our own prejudices and avoid stereotypes and hyperbole. We can help by listening to and amplifying the voices of those who are marginalized. We can avoid feeding into contemptuous social media. We can replace contempt with warm-heartedness. No interdependent web can be strong and whole when othering works its way in. And there is no need to other if we truly believe we are all sacred beings and honor pluralism. Lastly, I share this. Every time someone tells me that only some of us deserve human rights, or that my trans family does not exist, I'm not going to get upset and clutch my pearls. No. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to clutch my values and say, not in my backyard. May it be so.